So a lot of the examples I have here are actually from, they're from our company, but they're being done also with other breeders in other companies and also with some universities. So overview of the crop. Cool and warm season grasses are used for lawns, golf courses, sports fields, parks, roadsides. Grasses occur naturally in biomes that are too dry for trees. So this thing that they're real high water users is false. They're adapted to being grazed by herbivores, native or introduced species, and that's how they originated, was something ate them, and that's why they can tolerate being mown, some of them very short. The growing points of grasses tend to be at or below ground, so they respond well to being defoliated. They can spread by seed or vegetatively through rhizomes, stolons, depending upon the species. And most of our species of grass are primarily wind-pollinated. They're self-incompatible. That means they can't pollinate themselves effectively, and their seed increased. But some of them we also do increase vegetatively or by apomixis. So turfgrass breeding, the first organized breeding, at least mostly in the United States, was in the 1920s. And in that time, it was selection of superior plants from turf by the USDA and the USGA, that's the United States Golf Association. And they developed what they called the Arlington Turf Garden, where they looked at some of these plants that they had collected at really old golf courses and other sites. The Pentagon is now on top of Arlington Turf Garden, so it isn't there anymore. Then there were what we would call ecotype selections, and those were some of the first ones that were sold on the market. Things like Lynn perennial ryegrass, Highland, they called it a colonial, it's actually a dryland bent, Seaside creeping bent, those are just like selections from natural stands of grass. And in fact, velvet bent grass, people often think it came more from what they called South German bent. It actually came, a lot of the seed came from Prince Edward Island, and there was actually populations where people harvested both velvet bent and colonial bent on Prince Edward Island in Canada. In 1947, Marion Kentucky bluegrass was released, and it was the really first leaf spot resistant Kentucky bluegrass, and it's actually the basis of much of the seed industry in the United States because there were certain growers who would plant a crop, they would harvest it, they would make enough money off of it that they could buy more land. And that was actually the original basis of both what was then turf seed and became pure seed now, and Jacqueline seed was based upon harvesting Marion Kentucky bluegrass. In the 1970s, bluegrasses were the first species, and they could be protected by plant patent because of their apomixis. It was like vegetative reproduction through the seed. So you could protect them, so there became an incentive for industry to actually have protected cultivars. Shortly thereafter, about that same time in 1967, they started the Manhattan Ryegrass Marketing Association, which was one of the first improved perennial ryegrasses for turf. And in the 1970 in the United States, the Plant Variety Protection Law was passed, which gave more incentive to both universities and to industry to actually do breeding in turf grasses because they could protect that you talk about years of research that you could protect it. So now we utilize plant variety protection. We can use the American Seed Association, the AOSCA for protection, and university release boards to protect and to qualify for certification in the United States. Europe, and if you were here yesterday, you heard a little bit about the DUS system they use, which stands for Distinct, Uniform, and Stable, which is run by the governments in Europe to help in their protection of improved cultivars. And in Canada, for years there was a system of registered breeders. They would accept other countries' cultivars, and they have their own system that they've developed. And I am a registered breeder, by the way, in Canada, so I can cite breeder tags. So USA breeding, very often it was a public-private cooperation. A lot of public breeding has been done, and then private companies such as us may work with public breeders or by ourselves, but we cooperate in selecting for seed yield and other traits. And for us, seed yield is, I don't care what the turf quality is, seed yield trumps everything because our growers will not put it in the ground unless they have adequate seed yield. In the US, as in Canada, there's many different environments to develop cultivars for. Most of the cultivars sold in Canada for turf actually originate in the US or Europe at this point in time. There's not as much breeding per se in Canada for turf cultivars. Seed production on cool season grasses tend to be in Oregon, Washington, Minnesota, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Europe, and New Zealand. And we get seed from all those sources, and we ship seed out from all those sources. Seed production for warm season turf grasses primarily are in California, Oregon, and Oklahoma. And then also a lot of our warm season grasses, they're just vegetatively increased, and sod growers in the area of use tend to do a vegetative increase. So breeding behavior on most species, the first thing to determine if you're breeding a new species, and I've done that a few times, grasses in general, like I said, are wind cross-pollinated, self-incompatible, so they normally cannot self-pollinate. We depend upon population development and moving means by selection, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Inbreds are very hard to develop, which is typically used for corn and other grasses for hybrids. Most of our species have high ploidy levels, more than one set of chromosomes, which means multiple copies of each gene. So our perennial ryegrass are diploids, most of them, so they only have one set of chromosomes. But almost everything else has multiple sets of chromosomes. And so because of all the different sets of chromosomes, it's harder to determine genetics and to actually fix genes in the populations. Kentucky bluegrass has apomixes. It's facultative apomixes. That means not 100% of them are ever exactly the same, but most of them, you plant a crop of Kentucky bluegrass, what you get off is genetically the same as the mother plant you started with. We do have some dioecious species in these grasses. Poa arachnifera and buffalo grass are both dioecious. That means they have male and female species or plants. And so you have to have a cross between a male and a female plant to get seed produced. And then there's a few that do pseudo-vivipary, which are bulbils and seed heads instead of seed. And so Poa bulbosa is an example of a species that has that. Just to show you a little bit the size, the other reason we don't develop hybrids, this shows you, this is actually some grass flowers that's at a museum in Boston at Harvard. And you can see the tiny, this is perennial ryegrass, but you can see how small perennial ryegrass is. And then one of the species I do a lot of work with is creeping bentgrass. And the bentgrass flower is 1.3 millimeters in length and 0.3 millimeters width. You really can't get in there and emasculate to do hybrids. So we depend upon more that self-incompatibility if we're trying to do crosses. So turfgrass breeding programs. In the United States, major programs, public ones include Rutgers, University of Minnesota, University of Georgia, Florida, UC Riverside, Oklahoma State, Texas A&M, and Mississippi State. Private ones, DLF, Pure Seed, Peak Plant Genetics, which is Mountain View Seed, Radix, Lebanon have private programs. There are some other ones out there. We utilize a lot what's called our NTEP, our National Turfgrass Evaluation Program, and most of our cultivars are actually entered into this. And good performances in the National Turfgrass Evaluation Program really helps you market a variety. And it's a large and developed market for turfgrass cultivars. In Europe, there's both private and public breeders, and like we said, someone talked yesterday about DUS trials and EU lists and how to get on it. In Australia and New Zealand, there are a few public and private breeders. There's more forage ones than there are turf, but actually one of the bigger ones, which is PPG Wrightson, is actually owned by DLF also. And there's less public testing of varieties. In Asia, we see more forage than turf breeding. We get testing in the US and Europe, and we see seed production. So for instance, in Korea, they do a lot of forage annual ryegrass, and we do a lot of the increase of that in Oregon and ship it back to Korea. In South America, they do forage warm season breeding. They test in the US and Europe, and they bring in cool season, primarily forages, and just some turf. So Asia and South America, they will bring in cultivars primarily developed either in Europe or in US, but they'll do their own forage breeding down in those areas. So breeding cool season grasses, cooperative research, public and private breeders. Normally, most of the private breeders are actually in the Pacific Northwest, evaluate for seed production and for general quality there. In the Pacific Northwest, we're less suitable to screen for diseases and for stress. So some of us have additional locations in high stress areas. DLF actually has additional areas besides Oregon where we look for both, primarily for turf quality, but also some seed things in Kentucky, Wisconsin, and Ontario. And Pure Seed has a site in North Carolina that they look at their cool season grass in. The public breeders, many work with the private breeders to help screen for seed yield and commercialize. Warm season grasses, vegetative increase through sod growers. Public breeders can do those longer term projects, those genetic studies, many of them that he talked about earlier on the forage side. Some of those same sorts of things are being done by public breeders in the United States on turf. Then sometimes with public breeders, I find they have a thing, many programs, when to release a variety. As soon as you get it somewhere close, find somebody and get it on the market, because it doesn't make anybody, it doesn't help your customers, it doesn't help your consumers if it's just sitting there on your research farm. So breeding cool season grasses, the emphasis depends upon the species and market segment. I have bred 19 species of grasses, some of them more than others, but there's a lot of different grasses out there. Disease resistance is always important in all species. It's probably the primary thing, because if we can reduce the amount of fungicides used or keep the grasses higher quality, you're better off. In American markets, we love dark green color, fine texture and density. Europe, they tend to do a lighter green color on a lot of their grasses. We look at wear tolerance and recovery, and the timing of wear can be variable for the sport and the location that you're looking at it. So if, for instance, in Europe, they play what they call soccer, or they call football, we call soccer. They'll play it during the winter, where in the United States, that tends to be played more, in some areas all year round, but more over the spring to fall. Winter active growth is important in Pacific Northwest, California, and southern markets. Salinity tolerance is where a lot of effluent and poor quality water is used to irrigate turfgrass areas. A lot of roadsides and sidewalks, salt is used for ice control. So salinity tolerance is a very important characteristic in turfgrasses. Drought tolerance or efficient water use is becoming more and more critical, because people do not want to use potable water for necessarily for turfgrasses, so we need ones that can tolerate drought. And seed yield is critical in getting to market. So goal of variety development, turf versus seed production. And I'll tell you right out, low seed production will negate high turf quality anytime, and if it's got a low seed yield, it'll never make it to market. So production goals for seed include high seed yields, early heading, at least in the Pacific Northwest and Oregon, disease resistance, stem rust resistance, and stress resistance. The turf goals, which sometimes conflict with it, we want high seed yields, but turf wants high density. Actually, late heading tends to be less stemmy and have higher turf quality, but if we go too late in heading, at least in Oregon, where a lot of it's produced unirrigated, it will not have the seed yield we needed if it's later in its heading date. The diseases may be different between seed production and turf. Wear tolerance is important in turf goals, and both of them have the stress resistance. So plant breeding is the core of research, and this is kind of what he had the picture showing. Harness the natural genetic variation that exists in plants and select for features that improve turf and forage, but also preserve seed yield. So we take varieties and collections, we put them into breeding material, we select out populations of plants, we do field evaluations, we select the best, we may go ahead to another population, and eventually we will come out and we may go around this circle a few times before we come out with a new variety. So in general, what you see is, say we have a characteristic. So this is a dollar spot that's attacking creeping bent grass. Lovely, isn't it? And you're trying to find those that have none or less dollar spot. So what we do is there's a natural variation that occurs, and we try and select out that portion of the population that has less dollar spot than anything else in that particular thing. We take those plants, we cross them, and essentially we then move the mean by selection. So we cross them together, and then again we take off those high performers at that top end, and we're essentially moving the means by selection. So when we identify breeding materials, we use existing varieties or breeding populations. Tends to be the easiest and quickest way to get improvements, especially if you're selecting primarily for one trait. So you have an improved variety, and it's really good for a lot of characteristics or a couple of them, but there's one disease that you don't have. So you may find those really improved varieties and see if you've got in your existing populations ones that perhaps also have resistance to this newer disease or a disease you haven't been breeding for resistance are. And you may do it in multiple environments. We also still do some collections from old turf sites. It's important to cross those with improved material, and it's important in finding new genes. So for instance, that's close to 20 years now, when gray leaf spot first showed up in perennial ryegrass, we had no resistance in our existing varieties, and we had to go out and find some material that had resistance to gray leaf spot. A lot of that material came out of Europe. They weren't very good-looking perennial ryegrass plants, but we crossed them with the best breeding material we had, and then we were able to preserve those genes for gray leaf spot resistance and improve the genetics over a couple cycles. So we may do survivors and trials with high stress. This was acid soil, drought resistance in Georgia, and this was actually mown space plants in Missouri, inoculated with 5 strains of brown patch disease, and these are actually tall fescue, and each square of 30 plants came from the same mother plant. So we cross-selected parent plants, and we usually do what we call a polycross. It's the most common. There's a small to medium block of plants from 2, which can be common in Europe, to over 100. I don't put 100 in mine. The progeny or offspring that are grown from the seed are called half sibs. And usually you harvest each plant individually. You know who mom is and dad's anybody else in the block. Okay? You can also do paired crosses or modified back crosses. Kentucky bluegrass, the hybrids are developed in a greenhouse or in isolated plots, and it's under conditions that encourage crossing because most of the plants you're going to get off are just like the mother, and you're trying to find a few plants that are different from the mother that have some of the genes from the father in there. So this is parent plants in a crossing block. The progeny of each plant will be placed in turf and or space plants, and that will enable us to select the parents with same heading or anthesis dates. So this is actually our half-sib progeny crossing blocks in Oregon. This was actually during the drought in 2015. And you can see some of them are pretty green, and some of them weren't so green during that in our space plant. So each row going this way, not this way, each row going this way is all from the same mother plant. And each of those blocks is one breeder block that may become a new cultivar, or maybe we'll select some plants out of that are better, and they may be going on to the next cycle of selection. We also do turf plots, often of those half sibs. All the plants in a plot are from the same mother or grandmother, or composites. Turf plots are rated for quality, disease resistance, and color. We use a 1 to 9 scale if we're rating them. 9 equals best or rated by percent. We use space plants for uniformity and seed yield. These are evaluated usually from 1 to 4 years depending on the species and the goal, and it enables selection of parents in a variety. We can check inheritance. Marker or genomic selection may decrease time. I haven't seen it yet. We're hoping. So this is just a breeding history of one of our newer tall fescues. And basically, on the far, there's the variety that came out. There's the next ones to the right are the plants that were in that original polycross block. And it shows the origin of them. And you can see all those little green blocks. Those are ones where we had pulled out a variety and then we selected another one from that variety and continued down. But you can see like that one line, there's about 10 years represented there of continually selecting for improved characteristics in that particular lot. So it gets kind of complex sometimes keeping track of the maternal side of each of these. So this is a progeny trial data. This is one where we were developing a new creeping bent grass with Rutgers University. And there's a thing there that lists where the first plots came from, and they came from greens trials that were planted from 2009 to 2012. The best ones were selected. They were put in a crossing block, and in 2016, we looked at those. We did evaluations for 5 years on that particular material. The green block shows dollar spot was one of the most critical characteristics we were looking for. We were also looking at turf quality, wear tolerance. There were 3 different diseases we evaluated for. And you can see that actually we shipped from these blocks. We ended up selecting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines that went forward from this block. So this is the crossing block after we moved the parents from that trial. And again, we were looking for uniformity. We evaluate them both by drones, and we ground truth everything to make sure they're uniform and they have the correct growth habit, and they all match each other to the best of our ability. And this was the first year data out of University of Minnesota of INTEP on this trial of this variety, and that was 007XL. It had great establishment density, good brown patch resistance, which was another disease we'd looked at, and in other trials it showed excellent dollar spot resistance. So plant breeding is a numbers game, and this is part of what goes on. So Oregon space plants, we typically have somewhere between 120,000 to 150,000 space plants each year. And then in Oregon and Kentucky on turf plots, we have about 21,000 turf plots, and now we have quite a few in Wisconsin. So some of these numbers don't represent our new Wisconsin location. So the space plants, we do 5 ratings from March through July, some by drone, some by walking them. It used to be all by walking, but we do more by drone. And the 20,000 or so turf plots, 9 ratings from March through November. So we have a lot of numbers. So we have to, if you end up, we're doing about somewhere between 800,000 to 1 million ratings in 1 year to come up with all the cultivars we're going to have in the next few years. So that whole numbers game can be the bottlenecks to the next technology. So one of the things about breeding either turf or forage for most of us, corn breeders breed one crop, and for most, seed yield is the only priority. Turf breeders must breed for seed yield, but the selling points are turf quality, disease resistance, drought tolerance, establishment vigor, recovery. We deal with many different species, different ploidy levels, and different uses. The same is true of forage breeders. They must breed for seed yield, but they also have all these other characteristics that are important. So these are some of the tools we can go for. As far as genetic engineering, currently on the market, there are only 2 turf grasses on market that have had genetic engineering. They're Provista from Scott's. They're Roundup Ready and slower growing Kentucky bluegrass and St. Augustine. Alfalfa, there are many cultivars that are genetically modified, Roundup Ready, low lignin, quite a few of those. There's new technology, just like he talked about earlier, has less issues, CRISPR, but deciding the targets and the need for multiple species is always a concern. Market-assisted selection, often they only work well in the population they were developed in. We need, again, to identify targets and genes for big effects. So we're doing some genotyping by sequencing. Sequencing is much cheaper. First work in diploid and tetraploid perennial ryegrass, less complex. And just go through this real quick. And hopefully what we're looking at, heading date, seed yield, some of our genomic selections suggest we should be able to do this, investment in future, and identify the best plants with less field work. Instead of just cutting off that N, it gives us a better idea of where that N, and we could do it with less populations and be more accurate. So Oregon, some of the things we're doing at our Oregon station, we're looking at nitrogen use efficiency, and these are actually looking at turf plots, and you can see we've got some that have 4 pounds of N per year, some at 2 pounds of N per year, this is turf, and some at 1 pound of N per year. And we're trying to find the ones that there isn't that big a difference. And then we're also screening some of those for reduced nitrogen in seed production to see if we can get a correlation between them. We do seed production trials, so this is a production trial. We have seed yield potential. This is some of the work we've actually been doing with our new perennial ryegrass cultivars, looking at nitrogen use efficiency with plant growth regulators, and it's dryland in Oregon. We looked at 8 cultivars, 4 reps, and we've had always the highest yield with 225 pounds of N per acre with 24 ounces of PGR, but actually we had a negative net return on investment, and we had our highest return on investment with less N and with PGR. And in all cases, if we didn't put on a plant growth regulator in Oregon, we ended up with lodging in our perennial rye. And this is part of what's going on, why we're looking at these further, is the older cultivars of tall fescue, you see the one there in the middle, compared to our newer ones. The turfgrass cultivars are now significantly shorter and denser and faster tillering than our old ones are, and we have to make sure that we're still managing them correctly for seed yield potential. Perennial ryegrass breeding for seed production. U.S. cultivars are considered early heading, anthesis, and harvest compared to European cultivars, and they were developed to be produced without irrigation in Oregon. Recent weather, we get drought during spring, have impacted non-irrigated production. So selection for drought resistance in diploid and tetraploid perennial rye may improve that multi-year unirrigated production. Weather during pollination and seed filling can impact seed yield, and different species pollinate at different times of day. So like creeping bent grass from 10 a.m. to 12, bluegrass from 1 a.m. to 4 a.m. So if we get heat during pollination, we're finding we've had it damage our seed crop if we get heat at the wrong time of day, or the wrong time of year when we're actually doing our pollination. So we may have to shift how we're doing our seed yield and our analysis. And drought tolerance of tall fescue, it's better able to produce long-term in the Willamette Valley than our current perennial ryegrasses. So this just shows you, we have control varieties in here, and we look at yield, and we're always trying to look at the ones that have a higher yield potential in our seed yield trials than our control varieties. And this kind of shows you some of the recent stuff. This is, the green means good. That means they did better than the controls. The red is not good. So there were some recent ones. These were the last NTAP. And there's these ones, the RS3 and RS1 tall fescue. These were selected at Rutgers for drought tolerance and rainout shelters. But when we put them in seed yield trials in Oregon, they were always about 80% seed yield, so we never even asked a grower to put this in the ground. They have great turf quality. They have really high ratings in INTEP, but we can't ask a grower to put them in the ground when they've got 80% of the mean seed yield. So these are some of the things we're looking at. We run drought trials. This is actually trying to look at water use efficiency. We're doing drones, looking also and trying to look at our things and doing part of our ratings using drones. This is actually not turfgrass. This is one of our clovers. Digital image analysis, which we use Lightbox on. The National Turfgrass Evaluation Program, it's kind of our Bible on whether we actually can make it to market. But we continue to look at different things. So the average yields this is from Tom Chastain at Oregon State, was going up over time. I don't know, part of that was through breeding, part of that through plant growth regulators. And I think we've kind of reached a plateau, but our expected yields in Oregon for 2,000 to 2,500 pounds per acre currently for tall fescue and perennial rye. One of the things people talk about native species, USDA says creeping red fescue is native in Canada and the United States. So if anybody says anything about creeping red fescue, you're growing a native species, okay? And don't ever let them tell you differently. So types of Kentucky bluegrasses, there's different ones. So trial data, this is bluegrass seed yields. Bluegrasses are very finicky. We can run seed yield trials in different spots of Oregon and into Washington, and different types of those Kentucky bluegrasses perform better in different areas. So we spent, if you see that some of these are A12-2, A12-1, these are ones we've been looking at since 2012, looking at both turf performance and seed yield, and we're finally bringing those to market this year. So that's only 13 years, okay? So USA turfgrass breeding, the goal is a better environment with reduced inputs. Most breeding is still done in the traditional manner using progeny turf plots and space plants. Genetic studies allow breeders to better understand those important traits. Certain traits are useful in many environments and others have reduced usage. United States has many different environments and many different needs in breeding programs. And that's any questions. Native is it was here before, usually what's defined is it was here in the continents before the Europeans came over, is usually what they say. Some of them will call naturalized, but if you actually look, there's quite a few species that we call circumpolar native. So like Dischampsia cespitosa, tufted hairgrass, is a circumpolar native. Velvet bentgrass, if you look at where it actually occurs and you look at some of those things, it actually seems to be a circumpolar native. It occurs in Scandinavia, over through Siberia, crosses over. So creeping red fescue appears to be one of those. Now, it's not saying all populations are native. We may have brought some stuff from Europe also to cross with the native material, but it is a native species, and it's one of those ones that I think when people talk about natives, they assume just because it occurred in Europe, it can't be native to the Americas, but they can be, and there's a lot of records of them, especially in grasses. And I think it's because they kind of followed the same thing as, you know, the immigrants, when they came across like Siberian, those plants came across also. They weren't, but they weren't introduced by Europeans. Any other questions? Thank you. If you want to ask anything later, just let me know.